and gentlemen, family or friends, it's your friendly neighborhood Kevin Hines again, and we're here on September 26th for the Hope Rising Summit, a virtual summit about suicide prevention, hope, healing, wellness, and recovery from mental struggles. And today I am with the one and the only and the amazing Jas Rawlinson, who wrote the book Reasons to Live, One More Day Every Day. And she's done so much more than that for her community, and she's an amazing human being, a gifted human being, who cares about the cause of suicide prevention, wellness, and recovery from pain. And she's here to tell her story. Jas, hi, how are you?
I'm so good. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this event. It's such an important event, so it's an honor.
Wonderful. We're glad to have you. Jas, can you tell us, we know that you first fell into the depths of chronic depression and anxiety at the young age of 10 years of age. You were a girl growing up with a family there was violence in the family. You felt isolated, you felt alone, and you had no idea what was going on inside your own home. It was a kind of a big mess, and you were left alone in the depths of your mind to deal with it. And by the age of 17, you describe yourself as being deeply suicidal and struggle to make through each day. Can you tell us what happened back then to lead to that? From the kind of take us through the ages of 10 to 17.
Yeah, well, just like you said, from the age of 10, I was really in a very deep depression. But back then, I had no idea what was actually going on inside my head because we didn't have campaigns back then. I don't know what it was like in America, but in Australia, and particularly the small little country valley that we grew up in, there was no awareness about family violence, about domestic violence, mental health, anything like that. So, I'm blessed to have a mother who is she's such a wonderful person, and she tried so hard to help me get out of that depression and to get through every day where, with living with that constant, sense of walking on eggshells. That's really the only way I can talk about being around my dad. It was just a constant state of walking on eggshells, never knowing what kind of person we were going to come home to. And she did her best to try and help me kind of stay afloat. But like I said, without those campaigns and understanding, and just the fact that we did live in a very small country area, I did feel very alone. And I also it also took me until I was about 16 years old to tell any of my peers or a little bit about what was going on. So I think the ages of 10 to 16, that the depression kind of really started to snowball and get worse and worse. And then I guess going into high school and having sleepovers with friends and things like that, I think that made the depression spiral as well, because I would look at my girlfriends and say, how come their families are so perfect? And I mean, talking with some of them now, their families weren't perfect. We were all just keeping our crap to ourselves. But, some of them did have really good families and they were really lucky. And I just couldn't understand why I was living in this home with this really, volatile father. And that just made me feel more alone, and probably was a reason why I didn't tell anyone. Mm. So it was about age 16 when I actually, I started dating a friend of mine, and I told him a little bit about what was going on over time. And I told my best friend, and I always find it important to share this, because even though telling them a little bit about what was happening in my mind and in our home, even though it didn't fix the problem, it did help me to feel that little bit less alone. So it helped to kind of lessen the burden a little bit, just knowing that it wasn't just me carrying it,
Yeah. So your father was the perpetrator of the violence in your home. And at age 18, tragically, he took his life. And following his death, you became very emotionally damaged, and you found yourself constantly gravitating toward ending up in unhealthy relationships. Can you talk about that for all the
Mm.
young girls out there who go through this in their daily life? Tell us about your experience if you can.
Yeah. So those ages between sort of 16 and 18, I'd say I got, just to give you a sense, I got worse and worse with my depression and the suicidality. And then, just as I finished school, my dad actually, took his life. And that was a real shock, to our family. There were certainly warning signs there, and he'd made threats before. And my mum had always tried to get him help and tried to steer him towards getting professional help or anything, even taking supplements or talking about medication, just anything. But he refused to get any help at all. He wouldn't even take vitamins because the thought of taking something for his mood, was, in his view, that meant that he obviously wasn't strong enough and he was too weak. So, we talk about things like, it ain't weak to speak, the hashtag from Livin. And, that was really my dad's issue. He just wouldn't get any help for himself. And so, it was shortly after I finished school that he actually took his life. And it's very hard to explain to people what that was like, because usually if you lose a parent to in any way, but particularly suicide, the first thing people say to you is, "Oh, Jas, I'm so sorry for your loss. Like, you must be devastated." And it was really, really hard to reconcile the feelings inside of myself, and also to share that I was devastated that he did that, but I was also relieved, because for the first time since about the age of 10, there was no violence in the house. And I wasn't waking up every day listening for the footsteps or the way that the gravel on the driveway sounded when his car came up the driveway. I wasn't cowering in my cupboard, like hiding in fear. And so that was why, to come back to your question, that was why I was so emotionally damaged, because I'd lived through 8 years of, stress, fear, anxiety, violence. And then on top of that, I had this guilt that I must have caused this. Like, I must have, because I wished for him to disappear. And all I really wanted was the violence to go away.
Yeah.
And but I felt like I had caused it. And then I had all this guilt. And then I went out into the world as this emotionally damaged young woman. So, and then to answer the second part of your question, studies and research have shown that girls, particularly girls that grow up in homes with a dysfunctional father, have a very heightened risk of becoming pregnant at an earlier age, of going into abusive relationships. And I was certainly the one that kept gravitating to those emotionally abusive relationships. And one of those led to a sexual assault when I was 20. And so it was just like it was basically a decade of just a lot of trauma that I had to go through. So.
Wow. And that trauma, did it cause PTSD in you and things like that? Did it affect you in that way? Was it something that you couldn't get away from for a long time?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you asked that, because I never recognized myself as having post-traumatic stress or PTSD or anything like that. I kind of just got on with things, and especially after that sexual assault, I really made a very clear decision that I was going to stop hanging out with some of the people that I had been, stop putting myself in certain situations. And I kind of just, got on with life, tried to make the best of it, still struggled with depression, a loss, no sense of purpose or true identity or anything like that. But it actually wasn't until 10 years later, so until I was 30, that I actually started having PTSD-like symptoms. And it
Wow.
was because I'd stepped into doing a lot of advocacy around domestic violence, child abuse, things like that. And yeah, it was in 2016 that I co-founded one of Australia's first domestic violence memorials and the first domestic violence memorial here in Brisbane, Queensland. And I'd been talking to women who were sharing about their experiences. And I just kept thinking the whole time, gosh, I am so lucky that I never experienced anything like that. Gosh, aren't I so lucky that I got through life without being in an abusive relationship? And I had never put two and two together that the person who sexually assaulted me, who I had dated on and off for 18 months, had actually done many things that constituted as emotionally abusive. He had used gaslighting on me, which is a psychological form of manipulation. And I never put any of that together until then. And then that it was like it just broke me. And I had to go back and remember and relive that period of time after the sexual assault, and remembering all the things that had sort of happened in the 18 months prior to that, realizing that it wasn't just the sexual assault, that there'd been like other things leading up to it that I had not put together and maybe didn't really want to kind of join the dots. So yeah, I did have those PTSD type symptoms at age 30. But thankfully I was able to find a really wonderful psychologist who, it's probably only the second psychologist I'd ever seen. My first experience was not good. And she was wonderful. And she actually helped me to break through those symptoms in like just a couple of months, which was amazing. So.
Would you say that with her help, you were able to get to the root of your problems?
Yeah, definitely. Like for me, one of the biggest problems, it wasn't so much the assault itself because I had dealt with that, but it was more so that I didn't feel seen and heard when it came to what was done to me. And many survivors of assault or abuse will know this, is that you don't often get closure from the person who abused you. And for me, the thing that was really hurting me was that nobody in his sphere, in his world, knew what he'd done. Even his family didn't know. And it really upset me that I had had to lie to his mother after that had happened about the reason why I wasn't hanging out with him anymore. And I'd made up some excuse about, oh, he just needs to get his life together. Yeah, I can't be that person for him. And she actually suggested that I do some writing therapy and some letter therapy and write down everything that firstly I would like to say to him if I had ever had that chance, and anything that I would like to say to, a family member of his or, his partner. And it was just about getting all of these unsaid things out of my head. And that it just helped immensely because firstly, I was able to sort of get it out of my head, feel like I'd been able to speak what I wanted to speak. And then it actually gave me the courage to reach out to some family members of his. And I actually told them for the first time, that was told them what had happened 10 years ago and the real reason that I couldn't be in his life anymore. And I didn't quite get the response that I wanted from one of his family members. I think they just couldn't go there. It was too much for them. But I did get a response from another family member who validated what I'd been through, admitted that they had experienced similar things from that family member in different ways, and that they understood and they were really sorry that they were devastated to hear that he had done that to me. And just having that, even though I didn't speak to him and I chose not to take it any further, just knowing that I had kind of broken that silence and that people in his world now knew that was all I needed to be able to move forward. So it was really, really powerful.
Now, we know that you were very suicidal back when you were 17. But did any of these suicidal ideations follow you into your adulthood?
I think they did follow me for the first few years after Dad's death. I was very lost in that part of time, but I think, yeah, a couple of months after the assault, when I sort of started really trying to change my behavior and my decisions and make better decisions in life, they went away. So thankfully, I really haven't had to deal with anything like that. I think the closest I've sort of had to that was after the birth of my son. Thankfully, I didn't go into postnatal depression or anything like that, but I did go into some really dark places just from like the lack of sleep for about 14 months of insomnia. So that's probably about the closest. I had some really dark moments where I did have dark thoughts and was a bit scared of what was going on in my head. But yeah, thankfully, the suicidality was mostly kind of left behind by the age of about 21. So
Good. I'm really glad to hear that. I'm glad you're safe from that now. So some great things you talked about. You co-founded Brisbane's first domestic violence memorial. You were tackling the crisis of suicide in your country, not alone, of course, but you were really working toward that end. You began interviewing people around Australia about their experiences of overcoming trauma and surviving suicide. And now you have a best-selling series called Reasons to Live, One More Day, Every Day, which has been internationally endorsed by Professor Pat McGorry, Headspace, and Lifeline, which is amazing. Can you tell us about the creation of Reasons to Live, One More Day, Every Day, and why it was so important for you to get that series out there to the world?
Yeah, there was a couple of reasons, but it was shortly after I co-founded that domestic violence memorial that I started to realize that so many of the issues in our society all stemmed from trauma and mental health or mental illness issues. So I was doing a lot of work around issues like human trafficking, child abuse, domestic violence, and then I started to learn about the suicide crisis in our country, and I realized that trauma and mental illness and mental health issues were all the roots from which these issues like domestic violence and trafficking and abuse were all growing. And I started to think about my own journey and just thinking about like just really reflecting, and asking myself for probably the first time ever, how did I actually get through those years in high school? In 2016, when I started this project, which ended up becoming the Reasons to Live book series, we were losing 2,500 people a year here in Australia. And like, that's a lot for our country, and the size of it. It's about 8 people a day, roughly 6 men a day. And it just really struck me, the number of people we were losing, and particularly kids in Aboriginal communities. I mean, that just broke my heart to see news reports of 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds taking their lives. And I just thought, how is it that people and men and women and kids these days, they're just not able to hold on to hope long enough to get out the other side like I did? And that really inspired me to start this project and this book, where I began to interview people around Australia. And then with the second book, it branched out to working with people around the world. And I now work as a writing coach, helping people share their stories. But at that time, with the first book, I was just interviewing people and asking them, what are some of the toughest things that you've been through in your life? And can you share with me what it was like at that time? And did you have any support? What helped you get through? How is it that you are still here today when so many others have been through similar things and they haven't been able to find their reasons to live or their one more day every day? And it was really interesting. Like, I spoke to so many people, like Dan Price, who's a friend of yours. People
Right.
in small, pricey, people in small little Aboriginal communities, global hip hop artists. And no matter like what their background was, whether they grew up in a more privileged environment or not, whether they went through like a culmination of small like micro traumas or like major trauma, they had all struggled with some kind of, they'd all struggled with loneliness or despair or hopelessness at some time or another. And the things that really helped them, first of all, was just holding on to hope, just understanding that this too shall pass. And that was always my mantra as well in my dark times, was knowing that one day this was going to pass. But secondly, so many people, and this includes myself as well, we found that shifting our focus from ourselves onto somebody else, particularly by volunteering, getting involved with, important causes, was really, really helpful for helping to shift those negative mindsets. And just like getting behind something that you're passionate about and something that was making a difference in someone else's life was a really, really powerful way to actually break through a lot of the things that we were going through. So that was one of the key things I discovered.
So you've gone on this really long and arduous journey, but here you are today in a much better place. And I understand you're married and have children, is that right?
Yeah, married and have one child.
One child, it's amazing, beautiful. So it just goes to show you, you can go from hell to hope and find a great life past the pain you've been in. You're living proof of that. You're living proof of recovery. That's phenomenal. So Jas, as a writer, a best-selling author, you're an ambassador for Destiny Rescue, which I want to ask you about that in a minute, and a writing coach for aspiring authors who want to change the world with their story like you have. And you believe that everyone has a story with the power to change lives. I love that mantra as well. Tell me about Destiny Rescue.
So they're a really amazing Australian charity, but they work predominantly in Southeast Asian countries, particularly in Thailand, places like that. And I first came across them in around 2010. And this was when I started to get into my volunteer work, because I was in quite a depressed state at that part of my life. And I was just shocked to discover that, so many hundreds of thousands of people, and particularly kids, were being sold into trafficking, every day. It just broke my heart. I think, you have to forgive me because it's very early and my mind's a bit fuzzy, but I think the statistic was that like a child was sold every 20 seconds or every 30 seconds, something like that. And this doesn't just happen in countries that are third world countries. It happens in Australia as well. It happens in America. We know that, the average sort of age into trafficking and prostitution in the States is age 13. So it's not really entry into prostitution, it's entry into trafficking. And I was just shocked to see.
It's slavery. It's slavery.
Yeah, it's modern day slavery. There are actually more slaves today than there ever were in the past, when slavery was actually still a legal thing. It's, I think, the second fastest growing criminal,
Trade.
Trade in the world.
Wow.
But for me to see the faces of these girls who had been rescued, and to see that some of them were 13, 14, 15, and they'd already been in Destiny Rescue's care for 12 months, 2 years. You're talking about girls that were trafficked as 12-year-olds, or younger. They've rescued babies, they've rescued toddlers. And I just knew when I saw those photos, as I walked through this little stall at this festival back in 2010 or 2011, I just knew that I had to find a way to do something about this. I was in between jobs at the time, so I didn't even have a job. But I decided right then and there that I was going to be part of the solution and part of the fight against trafficking. So I signed up that day to sponsor a child, and over time that's led to my husband and I now sponsoring together many children. And yeah, Destiny Rescue, what they do is they they help to shut down pedophile rings, they rescue children, and most importantly, they rehabilitate those children and bring them hope and healing. So they help them to work through the trauma, and then they also help them to educate and empower them to go on to study and to be able to get a certification or a trade. I went over to Thailand in 2013, I think it was, with Destiny Rescue, and I actually got to walk through the red light districts there and see the bars where they had actually rescued children, and to see many other bars that were still open with girls that I had an experience there, like just very quickly, where I saw a girl who it just broke my heart because it was so clear that she didn't want to be there. And she reached out and actually touched my arm and just looked into my eyes. And it wasn't the same face that the girls were giving the men when they walked past. You know, they'd be sitting there and then they'd jump up and smile and act like they were, you know, loving it and come in. But this girl just reached out and touched my arm, looked at me, and I was just like, she's someone that Destiny Rescue needs to be able to reach. So I've always been very much behind what they do, and I'm very proud to be an ambassador and to be raising awareness of the fact that slavery is bigger today than it ever was in the past when it was legal, and it happens in every country, not just third world countries. It happens in Australia here, happens in America. And most often it doesn't happen from a stranger grabbing a child off the street. It often happens most often through grooming, either by someone the child knows or through social media. So we have many, many children who are being trafficked through Instagram. I'm going to say it, Instagram is a big one, and many other platforms. And sometimes it's their own parents who are trafficking through those profiles in plain sight. So it is a huge issue that I'm very passionate about, and I believe that we can all do something. Not everybody feels courageous enough or strong enough to maybe, you know, go and volunteer in these countries or work for an organization like Destiny Rescue, or maybe they don't feel brave enough to talk about it so publicly. But you know, you might start by choosing to donate to an organization who's looking to end trafficking, or you might just start by educating yourself about what's actually happening and sharing posts and having discussions with people, you know, conversation starters. So I think we can all do something, and it's really important to be aware of all these issues. So.
Well, Jas, you know, you're doing wonderful work. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work you're doing. It's powerful. It's motivating. It's moving. How do people find you online, your website, your social media handles? How can they help you help more people?
They can jump on my website, which is jasrawlinson.com. If you want to know more about my book series, Reasons to Live, you can grab that on jasrawlinson.com, or if you're an aspiring author that's ready to tell your story, you can reach out to me there. And I'm also on Instagram, Facebook under Jas Rawlinson. So you'll find me there too.
Perfect. Jas, thank you so much for being on with us here for the Hope Rising Summit 2020. We greatly appreciate your time. We wish you all the best in the world, and we're going to wrap it up there. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you, and we wish you the best.
Thank you so much, Kevin.